protect what we value.
And we choose what we value.
But choice without guardrails can wound.
Guardrails.
Welcome to The Debate. We are diving into quite a crucial conceptual clash today, one that really cuts right to the heart of how we understand freedom and morality in the modern world. And the tension, it emerges directly from the source material, which contrasts Louise Perry's trauma-informed sort of conservative feminist critique of sexual commodification with the direct testimony of Bonnie Locket, who asserts absolute agency, choice, and, well, self-ownership within the sex industry.
Right. So the central question we really have to wrestle with is this. Can genuine, non-coerced autonomy and psychological fulfillment truly exist for an individual operating within the sexual economy? Or is the inherent structure of sexual commodification itself necessarily degrading, regardless of what the individual might experience?
For this discussion, I will be arguing for the legitimacy of self-defined agency and happiness, specifically grounding the argument in Bonnie Locket's testimony of choice and, her emotional sufficiency.
And I'll be exploring the limits of that asserted individual agency. My position is that the systemic and, the moral implications of commercialized sex ultimately impose a kind of ceiling on well-being. It suggests that the structure itself is degrading, irrespective of a participant's subjective or immediate feelings of happiness.
Okay, so my position is really rooted in the necessity of taking individual testimony seriously. I mean, Lockett's experience actively pushes back against the narrative that all sex work is rooted in abuse or desperation. She claims her entry into the industry was a fully autonomous, conscious choice driven by, and these are her words, freedom, confidence, and independence, which, explicitly contrasts with the typical narratives of exploitation that others in Perry's research often highlight.
Sure.
And for Locket, the core metric for a successful life is entirely internal. It's about inner satisfaction. She puts this very clearly. As long as I wake up happy and go to sleep happy, I'll be proud of myself. Now, this deeply individualistic ethos places personal emotional truth above external societal or philosophical judgment. What's more, she asserts a kind of moral superiority through her radical honesty. When she provocatively compares herself to women who marry wealthy men for financial stability, saying they are sex workers too, they just won't admit it, she's essentially claiming that her open transaction is more authentic and independent than covert sexual leveraging. Her position seems to be that if the system is commodified, well, she should be the one defining the terms of her own participation within it.
Right. I see why you would strongly emphasize that claim of emotional sufficiency. But the tension for me lies precisely in the structural implications she's asking us to, maybe overlook. We have to first acknowledge that Lockett's reported lack of trauma and her high degree of happiness is a significant outlier. It's a stark contradiction to the bulk of accounts that Perry documented. But look, the debate isn't about discounting Lockett's feelings. It's about determining if her personal success can somehow neutralize what I see as a systemic harm.
Okay.
So the structural critique asks us to look beyond the immediate feeling of agency and examine the system itself. We're dealing with the friction between radical personal choice and what I'd call structural morality. This idea that certain economic systems fundamentally compromise human dignity by turning intimate access into a market good. The core issue then becomes whether agency can truly be absolute when it's built within this type of commercialized economy. We need to determine if self-awareness and, strong personal boundaries can actually serve as a durable substitute for societal protection. The central question really is what level of dignity is required as a foundation for well-being, rather than just being an optional side effect of a transaction. That focus on the foundation of dignity brings us directly, I think, to our first key point, authenticity and the nature of the sexual transaction itself. Locket seems to believe her honesty about using sex for capital makes her more authentic, perhaps, than those who might use sex covertly for stability. She views her freedom of schedule and her financial independence as tangible material benefits she obtains by, taking full ownership of the commodification process. She's effectively arguing that in a commodified world, embracing the transaction openly is actually the most independent path available. That's an interesting point, though I guess I would frame it differently. The simply being openly and independently engaged in a sexual transaction really neutralize the commodification itself, I would argue that the core disagreement is whether the transaction, the exchange of intimate access for capital, fundamentally compromises the concept of dignity, regardless of the individual's subjective perception of that exchange. Perry's concern is systemic, right? If the exchange of sex for capital establishes a market that relies on, let's say, temporary objectification, where the client is purchasing access to a role or an experience, then individual claims of self-ownership within that system are, well, perpetually vulnerable. Locket's transparency might protect her personally, I grant that, but it doesn't dismantle the structure that renders sexual access purchasable in the first place. And that is the root of the degradation as Perry sees it. We need to distinguish, I think, between psychological coping mechanisms and actual structural dismantling.
Okay, but I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because, arguably, Locket addresses that vulnerability through her active resistance to being defined solely by the client. She insists on defining the terms.
I mean, if we accept the structural degradation argument, absolutely, then logically, wouldn't we have to conclude that any professional context where emotional or even sexual availability is leveraged for capital, from certain entertainment roles maybe to high-end service jobs, must also be inherently degrading? Locket seems to be drawing a pragmatic distinction. She's not selling herself. She's performing a highly compensated service based on clear established boundaries that she enforces. Her ability to define those terms is her agency in action.
Well, I disagree that her ability to set boundaries sufficiently counters the systemic requirement for objectification. I see it more as a localized defense, not a cure for the system itself. And maintaining that defense requires significant psychological labor, the labor of constant boundary maintenance, just to remain intact. That effort in itself is a cost. Which forces us to consider our next point: resilience, boundaries, and objectification. Perry specifically probed Locket about physical and emotional limits, especially regarding intense or rough scenes, which Locket admitted do occur. Her reliance on personal communication, if something hurts, I speak up, is certainly active, yes? But is that really a sufficient safeguard?
Well, I'd argue it is sufficient if she defines her dignity internally. Locket's resilience seems rooted specifically in self-awareness and a kind of professionalism. Her pragmatic acceptance of client variety, her observation that some are fat, some are spotty, that's normal. That demonstrates a strong psychological boundary, doesn't it? She seems to view her clients with a degree of empathy, recognizing their nervousness and self-consciousness, which suggests she's capable of seeing them as fully human.
And by doing so, perhaps she resists the dehumanization inherent in the purely structural definition of the transaction. Her endurance is both physical and psychological, rooted, as she says, in knowing her body and boundaries. And maybe this professional detachment prevents the personal corrosion that the structural critique anticipates.
But I'm still not convinced that self-awareness alone can prevent eventual burnout or disconnection when the occupation fundamentally demands accepting constant objectification. It requires the individual to compartmentalize their sense of self and treat their body essentially as labor. The job demands she be available for acts she herself describes as rough and intense. That requires an extreme degree of psychological distance, surely. Furthermore, her ability to receive emotional validation and a massive confidence boost from client compliments, while yes, positive on the surface, is also highly contingent on external sources, specifically the desires of the market. The structural degradation often manifests not as personal revulsion, perhaps, but as a forced dependency on validation rooted in a commercial exchange.
I see the difference, though, as her choosing to integrate that validation, rather than needing it. Her strength could be seen in her ability to interpret the client interaction not as subservience, but as proof of her efficacy and skill. That acceptance, however, I agree, demands what you rightly termed a stubborn independence to insulate herself from societal discomfort and stigma. And that leads us, I think, to our final key contention: happiness and future planning versus these external expectations. If her happiness requires such profound insulation from external standards, is it truly robust? Is it sustainable?
Well, Lockett's ethos here is deeply individualistic, and it's very focused on the present. She prioritizes inner satisfaction over social approval, explicitly rejecting both conventional peer pressure and the kind of overplanning associated with a structured, maybe middle-class life.
Her commitment to living in the moment, even accepting she might stop in a year or continue for 10, seems to prove her commitment to immediate, self-directed happiness, free from the constraints of rigid societal timelines. She argues, quite compellingly I think, that being fixated on the future is a form of self-sabotage that prevents genuine happiness now. This looks like a deliberate choice to redefine value outside of the typical capitalist expectation of linear progression.
That's a compelling argument for radical autonomy. I'll grant you that. But have you considered the implications of rejecting all external expectations so absolutely? While it appears to be freedom, I worry that this extreme focus on immediate happiness and spontaneity could actually be a necessary psychological mechanism, a way to avoid confronting the inherent limitations and, frankly, the societal perceptions of a life built on commercialized sexual capital. I mean, the market for sexual access is notoriously volatile, isn't it? It's tied heavily to age and appearance. The structural critique would suggest that by relying on this market for identity and capital, Locket inherently places a kind of physical and economic limit on her long-term sustainability, even if the short-term feeling is one of total independence. Can happiness be truly genuine if it requires such profound resistance to the very concept of stability? Well, maybe I come at it from a different way. Perhaps that volatility is part of the freedom. She could be rejecting the anxiety of conventional stability that society dictates must be prioritized. Locket might be asserting that the psychological burden of long-term planning and conforming to rigid timelines is actually heavier for her than the burden of market volatility. So she's not hiding from the future. Maybe she's choosing to maximize her present emotional return. The structural perspective seems sometimes to suggest there is only one valid route to dignity, one based on conventional, non-commodified interaction. And Lockett's life actively proves, or at least suggests, that subjective happiness can be achieved by deliberately creating an alternative route. But that alternative route, as I see it, demands a continuous, maybe even exhausting denial of the surrounding moral reality. I think the crux of our disagreement rests on whether the individual's subjective experience can truly overturn the implications of the system they operate within. Lockett's strength is immense, clearly, but the system of sexual commodification remains. Her success may be an exceptional outlier, but it doesn't dismantle the mortal injury inherent in the structural economics of intimacy for potentially the majority of participants.
It seems we are left with a powerful philosophical tension then. Bonnie Locket's story offers, undeniably, an immensely compelling counter-narrative of choice, joy, and emotional self-sufficiency. It forces structural critics like Perry to really deeply consider the limits of their own definitions of trauma and victimhood when confronted with such assertions of radical, conscious agency.
Indeed, and that assertion of agency, while powerful, highlights the ongoing philosophical challenge of reconciling individual autonomy with these foundational structural concerns. Lockett's case necessitates, I believe, a deeper reflection on the trade-off. Can personal agency and self-awareness fully replace the need for societal mechanisms that aim to safeguard fundamental human dignity against commercial exploitation?
Yeah, we're really forced to weigh the undeniable subjective value of self-directed happiness against the structural concerns about how systems of commodification fundamentally shape human identity and relationships. Locket doesn't resolve the conflict. She really embodies the tension.
Exactly. It proves that the line between conscious choice and systemic necessity is far more blurred, far more complex than perhaps either side of the debate often wants to admit. It certainly leaves us with much more to explore in the source material itself.
Well, thank you for this essential conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today, well, it's to give you that intellectual shortcut right into some really dense, complex conversations happening now. We're looking at a pile of source material today that really gets at a fundamental modern contradiction. It's a clash, honestly, that can shake up how we think about power, sex, work, the whole lot. See, you've got this industry, sex work, that's so often linked, and sometimes rightly so, with deep trauma, exploitation, vulnerability.
Absolutely. That's the dominant narrative.
But then, standing right against that narrative, you have individuals claiming, no, actually, I find genuine fulfillment here, radical autonomy, and I'm completely psychologically okay doing this.
And that's the gap, isn't it? How do you reconcile those two things?
Exactly. How do you resolve that?
That's the tension that our sources really capture today. We're basically unpacking an intellectual showdown. It features two, you could say, archetypes of womanhood in the 21st century, completely opposed.
So it's bigger than just sex work itself.
Oh, much bigger. He gets into what female dignity means now, what's real liberation, and whose perspective counts more, the sort of moral conservative one or the pragmatic individualistic one.
Okay, fascinating. Let's break down the two main figures here. The sources frame this around a specific conversation, right?
They do. It centers on an exchange, or rather the ideas presented by Louise Perry, the analyst in this case, and Bonnie Locket, the subject.
All right, so Louise Perry, let's start there. We need to understand her viewpoint, where she's coming from. It's described as protective.
Yes, very much so. Louise Perry comes at this from what you call a moral conservative feminist position. She's openly critical, actually, of the sexual revolution and its consequences.
And it's not just theory for her.
Not at all. Her views are heavily influenced by practical experience years working in a rape crisis center. So for Perry, the default starting point, her primary data, is trauma.
Ah, okay.
Her framework almost automatically connects sex work and also things like pornography, the wider sexual economy, to systemic harm and exploitation of women. That's her lens.
So when you say anti-sexual revolution, what does that really mean in her argument? It's not just about being sort of old-fashioned.
No, it's a deeper critique. She questions whether sexual liberalization genuinely benefited women. Her argument often suggests it might have primarily served male interests, normalizing casual sex in a way that perhaps pressures women.
Interesting.
She's also critiqued things like no-fault divorce, arguing it sometimes leaves women economically vulnerable, especially if they structure their lives around marriage.
Right.
So her brand of conservative feminism sees the female body and sexuality as uniquely vulnerable in the marketplace, things that need, specific societal safeguards, boundaries, maybe even legal limits. Because for her, choice can often be an illusion when you factor in economic pressures or just sheer male demand.
Okay, that makes sense as a protective stance, especially given her background. So then, standing in direct opposition to that very cautious, trauma-aware view, we have Bonnie Locket.
Exactly. Bonnie Locket. She is the living counter-argument. She's the one forcing Carrie, and by extension us, to really grapple with these core assumptions.
And how does she represent herself?
She embodies the empowered, self-aware, modern libertarian sex worker archetype. Her entire argument is built on radical choice, complete self-ownership, real independence.
Okay, and this is key, right? She's not saying she overcame trauma to get here.
Crucial point. She explicitly denies that abuse or desperation pushed her into this. She insists her entry was chosen, and her fulfillment now is genuine. Not a coping mechanism, but real satisfaction.
So that really sets up the central puzzle for Perry in these sources, doesn't it? If Perry's framework assumes the sex industry inherently causes harm...
What do you do with Bonnie?
Yeah, what do you do with this data point, Bonnie, who seems, quote, psychologically unharmed? It challenges the whole structural argument about exploitation.
It really does. It creates a kind of intellectual bind. If Bonnie is telling the truth, if she is happy, fulfilled, financially secure, and making her own choices, then Perry's protective view has to confront the idea that maybe its moral concern is, in some cases, overriding an individual's lived reality.
Which takes us right into the core themes then. Autonomy, transaction, and this whole idea of redefining sex work itself.
Exactly. Section 1, let's dive in.
Okay, so Bonnie Locket. Her foundational point is this idea of conscious choice. It wasn't coercion, it wasn't desperation.
She frames her career as a path she actively selected, selected for specific benefits: freedom, confidence, independence, not as a last resort.
It's about self-possession from the get-go.
Absolutely. She completely rejects the victim narrative. By stating she entered willingly, freely, and even from a position of relative financial security, she sidesteps the usual trauma storyline.
And if you take away abuse or necessity as the root cause,
Then the whole debate shifts, doesn't it? It moves away from, do we need to rescue this person, towards how should society regulate this chosen activity, if at all?
and her explicit rejection of the victim label is powerful here. It's not just saying, I'm okay. It's almost a philosophical statement.
It is. It's the ultimate libertarian stance applied to the self. My body, my labor, my choice. And society shouldn't judge me morally just because it disapproves of my job.
She argues the victim label comes from societal discomfort, not her actual experience.
Exactly. And flipping that script is a source of power for her, defining herself on her own terms.
Okay, now here's where it gets really provocative. The sources highlight this comparison she makes to make her point about open transactions.
Ah, yes, the marriage comparison.
She basically says women who marry wealthy men for financial stability are, quote, sex workers too, they just won't admit it.
Yeah, that's a line designed to make people uncomfortable. It often does. But we have to unpack the logic she's using there. She's looking at relationships through a purely transactional economic lens. For her, both scenarios, her explicit contract work and a traditional marriage focused on stability, involve an exchange, access, intimacy, or companionship traded for financial security or advantage.
So the focus isn't the sex act itself, but the underlying economic deal.
Precisely. The trade of, let's say, relational or sexual access for resources. Right. And here's her kicker. She argues her way is more ethical.
More ethical? How?
Because of the transparency. She'd say, look, we have an open negotiation. Both sides know exactly what's being exchanged, money for time, for performance, for specific service. That, in her view, is more honest, more authentic than a similar transaction veiled in the language of romance and lifetime dependency. She sees the latter as a kind of hidden, maybe even institutionalized form of sex work, but one where the terms are fuzzy and potentially exploitative in different ways.
Wow. Okay. So by comparing her very open labor to what she sees as hidden or unpaid female labor within marriage, she's actually making a kind of critique of traditional structures.
You could definitely read it that way. It implicitly critiques the history of female economic dependence within patriarchal systems. She's essentially saying, society condemns my open transaction while sanctifying yours, which might be just as transactional but less honest about it.
And by monetizing her labor openly, she gains independence, avoids that dependency. Her honesty becomes her power.
That seems to be her argument. The power of not having to pretend the economic dimension isn't there. The sources note Perry didn't fully counter this specific angle effectively.
But, okay, let's push this. If we accept Bonnie's purely economic, libertarian definition of sex work as just labor, what happens to Perry's protective stance? Where does the concern for inherent dignity or potential harm go?
Well, if you fully accept Bonnie's premise, then any moral judgment or societal condemnation is just market interference. It's based on social squeamishness, not actual harm, unless the terms of the agreed-upon contract are violated.
So exploitation only happens if the deal is broken, not in the nature of the deal itself.
According to that strict libertarian view, yes, dignity isn't tied to the type of work, but to the fairness and voluntariness of the contract governing the work.
This really forces you, the listener, to draw a line, doesn't it? Is the problem the transaction itself, as Perry might suggest, or is it the lack of transparency, as Bonnie argues?
That's the core tension right there, the moral, trauma-informed definition versus the pragmatic, economic definition. And we need to keep that conflict in mind as we go deeper.
Because if you lean towards Perry's view, Bonnie might seem self-deceived. If you lean towards Bonnie's, Perry seems overly moralistic.
Exactly. So let's explore what allows Bonnie to maintain her perspective. What are her internal metrics for happiness? How does she measure success, if not by societal approval?
Okay, section 2, internal metrics. So she's rejecting external judgment. What does she replace it with?
It's remarkably simple, actually, and profoundly individualistic. She says point blank, as long as I wake up happy and go to sleep happy, I'll be proud of myself.
That's it, her own subjective happiness.
That's the primary yardstick. It's a commitment to her inner state, above all else. External approval, social norms, ethical frameworks imposed from outside, they don't seem to factor into her self-assessment.
And she acknowledges people might judge her.
Oh, completely. She says something like, other people might be disgusted in me and I accept that. The key is, she accepts it as their feeling, existing outside of her. It doesn't penetrate her psychological boundary.
Like an emotional firewall.
Precisely. External criticism is just noise. It's not valid data about her own worth or happiness. And this self-contained validation system is crucial to her claim of being psychologically unharmed.
But let me play devil's advocate here. Is that firewall real? Or is it perhaps a necessary psychological defense, like dissociation needed to do the work? How did she really stop the outside world's view from getting in?
That's a fair question. The sources suggest she bolsters that wall by focusing intensely on the benefits she gets from the work, both tangible and intangible.
Okay, like what specifically?
Well, the tangible stuff is obvious. The lifestyle, the travel, working her own hours, financial independence, freedom from a 9-to-5 grind. These are pretty standard markers of a good life in modern terms, right?
Autonomy.
Sure. But you said intangible, too.
Yes, and this is fascinating. There's a layer of emotional validation. She explicitly mentions that compliments from men, from her clients or fans, provide a massive confidence boost.
So it's not just about the money or the freedom. There's an emotional feedback loop.
Exactly. It seems the work itself provides a steady stream of affirmation that she's desired, admired, valued, at least within that specific context. And this emotional input, coming from the very market Perry might see as degrading, actually reinforces Bonnie's self-worth.
So it supports her waking up happy metric.
It seems to. It's like a closed-loop system. The work provides money, freedom, and ego boosts, which collectively fuel her internal happiness, which justifies the work.
So in a way, she's replaced traditional sources of validation, family approval, societal respectability, with this more immediate market-driven validation. That appears to be the case. The confidence boost acts like psychological armor, shielding her from the external disapproval.
For her, then, the combination autonomy, money, plus this constant ego reinforcement, it adds up to a job satisfaction that genuinely outweighs the social stigma.
That's what she strongly conveys. She's found a way to monetize her sexual self in a way that feeds both her independence and her self-esteem, allowing her to maintain that firewall.
Which brings us right back to Perry's challenge. Okay, if Bonnie feels this way, what about the actual risks? The resilience needed, the physical and emotional limits. Perry, coming from her background, must be probing for the psychological cost, the hidden damage.
Absolutely. This is where Perry really pushes, trying to find the cracks in Bonnie's armor. Section 3. Resilience and boundaries.
Perry specifically asked about limits, didn't she? Especially around extreme scenes, multiple partners, situations where vulnerability seems highest.
Yes, Perry is looking for that point where choice might break down, where the work becomes inherently damaging regardless of initial consent.
And Bonnie's response?
It's framed entirely around self-advocacy and communication. She doesn't deny some moments are, quote, intense or rough, but she insists her shield isn't naivete, it's hyper-awareness and speaking up.
This is where that quote comes in.
Exactly. The crucial boundary rule she states. If something hurts, I speak up. You can't sit there in pain and blame everyone else for it.
Wow. That puts the entire onus for safety squarely on the individual in the moment.
Completely. It shifts responsibility away from external rules or even client behavior onto her own immediate ability to assert herself. Safety isn't provided. It's created by her strength and her willingness to enforce boundaries right then and there.
That's the libertarian viewpoint applied directly to physical and emotional safety in a transaction.
It really is. Her safety isn't about societal protection. It's a skill she possesses the confidence to say stop, no, or change this, even under pressure.
But, and this seems like Perry's implicit critique, is that a model everyone can follow, especially someone who is desperate. Does everyone feel empowered enough to just speak up when the other person holds the power, the money?
That's the huge question hanging over this. Is Bonnie's confidence an outlier? Is it possible because she started from a place of relative security and choice, not coercion?
The sources suggest her approach requires something exceptional.
Yes, they imply it requires enormous strength, both physical and psychological. She mentions meeting stamina, almost athleticism for some scenes, but also this deep psychological comfort with sexual openness and unwavering confidence in her ability to define and hold her boundaries in real time.
So what does this self-awareness she talks about actually involve in practice? How does it protect her?
It seems to involve a kind of sophisticated emotional management, knowing her body's physical limits, knowing her emotional triggers, and critically, having mechanisms to depersonalize the interaction when needed, engaging in transactional intimacy without letting it degrade her sense of self.
So self-knowledge as the ultimate armor.
That's the core of it. Knowing her body and boundaries is framed as the protection, contrasting sharply with the traditional feminist call for external societal protection.
So Perry wants society to prevent the potential trauma. Bonnie demands radical internal resilience to neutralize any potential trauma.
You've got it. For Perry, the system itself is risky and needs external fixes. For Bonnie, the system is a market, and she needs to be internally fortified to navigate it safely. Her argument is, if you truly know yourself, you're protected. If you don't, no rule will save you from bad choices.
Okay, let's pivot slightly then to her broader life philosophy. How does this mindset play out in terms of her identity, her independence, her view of the future, even her view of clients?
Right, Section 4, Identity and Pragmatism.
Well, one key thing the sources mention is her resistance to planning too far ahead. She actively avoids rigid future fixation.
Yeah, she talks about having left a very structured life behind and embracing spontaneity. For her, overplanning is a kind of trap.
She has a quote about that.
She does something like, you become so fixated on the future you forget to live your life. Her career choice, for all its controversy, facilitates this focus on present happiness and flexibility. It's the opposite of a traditional career path.
And this lack of long-term planning, it reinforces her independence, doesn't it? Saying she might stop in a year or keep going for 10. It's purely based on her current feeling.
Exactly. It's a total rejection of external expectations about savings, retirement, career arcs. Her life, or at least her income stream, is structured to be adaptable moment by moment, based on her internal state.
Her identity itself seems crucial here, too. She's not hiding.
Not at all. Her professional identity is her authentic self, or at least presented that way. And this stubborn independence, as the sources call it, acts as a shield. It deflects public shame because she refuses to feel it. It deflects internal conflict because she insists this is her authentic choice.
She won't bow to peer pressure or societal discomfort because to her, it's simply irrelevant to her happiness.
It's like radical emotional honesty almost. She seems to view hiding or feeling ashamed as more degrading than the work itself. Shame is external, imposed. By rejecting it, she disarms society's main tool for controlling her. She owns her narrative.
Okay, but what about the day-to-day reality? Dealing with clients. This is where the rubber meets the road, pragmatically. Perry must have asked about objectification or, potential feelings of disgust towards clients who aren't conventionally attractive.
Oh, definitely. That comes up. And Bonnie's response is pure pragmatism, almost a clinical detachment.
How so?
She basically dismisses disgust as unproductive and superficial. She says some are fat, some are spotty. That's normal. It's a necessary mindset, right? To operate successfully in this field on her terms, she can't afford to be overly judgmental about clients' appearances.
So she depersonalizes the physical aspects, but you said earlier she observes their behavior.
Yes, and that distinction is key. She seems to maintain a professional distance from their looks, but she does notice their humanity. She mentions they're often polite, clean, even nervous or self-conscious.
Seeing their nervousness, their humanity, that stops it from being purely objectifying for her.
It seems to be part of it. If she just saw them as repulsive objects, perhaps she would internalize some degradation. But by seeing them as, regular, sometimes awkward human beings seeking something, she maintains her professional boundary and psychological equilibrium.
It's a professionalized empathy.
You could call it that. She doesn't seem hostile towards her clientele. It's an exchange, professionalized. She accepts their flaws. They accept her terms. This pragmatic acceptance allows her to do the job without absorbing shame or moral injury from the interaction itself.
Okay, this detailed picture of her mindset brings us to the final stage of this deep dive, summing up the philosophical clash and the unresolved questions left hanging.
Right. Section 5, the confrontation and the tension.
So how do we boil down this core conflict? You called them archetypes earlier.
Yeah, I think it's fair to see this as a really clear case study. It's postmodern feminism focused on individual agency and redefining terms versus a more traditional conservative feminism focused on protection and potential harms.
Louise Perry representing the latter.
Exactly. The moral conservative feminist. Her priority is women's safety. She's wary of sexual commodification. It's a protective view, emphasizing vulnerability.
And Bonnie Locket is the counter-archetype.
Precisely. The modern libertarian sex worker. She takes things society labels degrading, like transactional sex, and reframes them as chosen agency, power, even self-expression. It's this new wave of self-defined empowerment where internal feelings and choice are paramount.
Their conversation or the ideas they represent really forces some deep questions about freedom and morality, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Bonnie's unapologetic stance makes you ask things like, okay, can happiness be truly self-contained if it relies, even partially, on external validation like fan admiration or client compliments?
Yeah.
What happens if that validation disappears? Is the foundation stable?
And the big structural question, is agency ever truly absolute when it operates within a commercialized sexual economy? Does the market itself, with its own logic and pressures, inevitably shape or constrain choices, even if the individual feels totally free?
That's a fundamental question about power, isn't it? Does individual feeling override structural dynamics? Flowing from that, the third big question, hitting right at the core of the disagreement, can intense self-awareness and strong personal boundaries really replace the need for wider societal protections when it comes to human dignity?
Or does society still have some responsibility to shield people from potentially harmful markets, even if individuals volunteer to enter them?
Exactly. These are the tough, unresolved questions.
So the real value of digging into these sources is that they shatter simplistic views. You can't just say sex work is all liberation or all exploitation after considering someone like Bonnie.
Right. It captures this incredibly nuanced intellectual clash. You get Bonnie's detailed counter-narrative joy, control, choice set directly against Perry's backdrop of structural concern and potential trauma.
It forces a much deeper reflection on what freedom means, especially when sex and money intersect so directly.
And hopefully you, the listener, now have that framework. You understand the choice argument backed by Bonnie's fierce independence and psychological strategies versus the trauma-informed argument rooted in Perry's caution about commodification's inherent risks.
It's knowledge that lets you engage with this topic with way more nuance, understanding the specifics of Bonnie's philosophy, her pragmatism, her focus on inner happiness.
So we'll leave you with a final thought to chew on, something that builds on this tension.
Go ahead.
If we take Bonnie's metrics seriously, if self-control and inner happiness are the ultimate measures of a good life, at what point, if any, does the external economic structure of a highly commercialized, often anonymous market start to override that personal volition? Even if the person genuinely feels free and in control, does the system itself impose limits or exert pressures that shape the reality, regardless of the profession?
A fascinating question to ponder. Where does individual agency end and structural influence begin, especially when money's involved? Thank you for diving deep with us today.
See you next time.